Hi everyone, I'm Dr.Animaction, and if you've watched more than just one of my videos, there's a pretty decent chance you've noticed that I'm something of a technophile. I love vehicles, weapons, equipment, and gear, second only to characters when it comes to getting invested in a story or world. I'm the sort of person something like Mad Max and the Road Warrior was made for. Just the very thread of a story stitching together interesting people in really creative fighting vehicles. So that's why today's list will focus on the biggest, baddest, and usually most complex vehicles in 80s animated action. The mobile bases. But before we jump into that, if you love 80s action and talking about the characters, technology, and stories that made it great, make sure to subscribe. I've been pretty good about putting out a video a week since my relaunch, and your subs can help me grow and really get my footing. Enough of that though, let's get down to what you all came to see. Ground rules for this list are easy. Candidates just have to be mobile and be a base. What constitutes a base, you may ask? 3 things. 1, they've got to have a command and control functionality, meaning be a place leaders can oversee and run the battle. 2, they need to house, transport, and provide facilities for personnel, vehicles, and equipment. And 3, they have to have support facilities like research, engineering, or medical to help keep the battle going. If they check those boxes, they're eligible. And now that we've established that, let's look at my top 10 mobile bases. As is becoming my standard, we'll start with the Dishonorable Mention. This week, that spot goes to the Technodrome from Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. I mean, sure, this thing looks pretty cool, kind of like an Epcot Center on tank tracks, but it never really does anything. We rarely see it moving, never see it fighting, and have no reason to think it's much of a threat. It's supposed to be this nearly unstoppable war machine, but it's pretty much never anything more than set dressing. Even in the 1987 TMNT video game, which I'll remind you all was painfully difficult, the Technodrome was a pretty lame boss. Sure, it can survive being frozen in the Arctic, submerged in a volcano, sitting on the bottom of the ocean, falling into the Earth's core, and even getting sucked into a black hole, but none of that makes it worthy of a spot on this list. Moving on to our winners for the week, we'll start at the beginning, with number 10, Thunderbird 2 from Thunderbirds 2086. I know that technically the Thunderbirds in this series have a couple of bases, Thunderbird 6 being the biggest, the space station, which we'll probably see on a future list, and Thunderbird 17, which also may show up in the future. But 6 isn't really mobile, and 17 was used only for very specific situations. Thunderbird 2 was the team's everyday workhorse, and it did its job great. It could be configured with any of the other Thunderbirds from 7 to 16 to suit the needs of the mission. It had accommodations for the whole 5-member team, and a command space for mission planning. Plus, in its standard configuration, it served as a docking platform for Thunderbirds 1, 3, 4, and 5. And it's hard to argue that it didn't look pretty cool with 1 and 3 attached. But as far as bases go, it was more transport and staging platform than true base, and barely met my definition, so I'm keeping it down here at 10. Number 9 on the list is the Argo from Star Blazers, or if you're more of an anime fan, the Yamato. I'll admit that I came to Star Blazers through anime, as I'm not quite old enough to have watched the initial run, and so came to Star Blazers later in life. But I've quickly grown to love that vintage animation and almost sloppy Americanization that the show was comprised of. Anyway, on to the Argo. I think that the concept of repurposing a battleship that was several hundred years old from where it was originally sunk was, in practicality, stupid. But in creativity, pretty damn cool. As a mobile base, though, I was on the fence about this one. It definitely meets my criteria, with a command bridge, living facilities, fighter complements, engineering and fabrication facilities, etc. The thing that made me kind of hesitate was the fact that I can't imagine it being used to its full potential. Being based on a real-world vehicle, the cartoon version inspired me to research the actual IJN Yamato to learn about its real-world loadout and history. In the cartoon, the refitted Argo has a crew of 140-something and a load of 2 full fighter squadrons, which is around 24 to 26 planes. It also has some launch-type search and rescue vehicles. The original Yamato had a loadout of 7 aircraft, a crew of anywhere from 2,700 to 3,200 at the time of its sinking, and apparently some critical design flaws that made its class susceptible to torpedoes. It only used its main guns in combat once and was sunk just 3.5 years after it was commissioned in 1941. So firstly, I'm not sure it had the crew to really utilize all of its capabilities, and second, I'm not sure that by the time it was rebuilt to be space-worthy, there would have been much of the original Yamato left. Kind of a Ship of Ulysses type thing. Either way, though, I thought it deserved a spot on the list for the cool concept, the cultural significance, which is interesting reading if you got the time, and the real-world bases. And speaking of real-world derived concepts, that brings us to number 8, the USS Flag from G.I. Joe. The Flag makes the list because, well, it's a proven concept. It's essentially a real-world Nimitz-class U.S. Navy aircraft carrier. Any Navy folk out there who know better than me, feel free to tell me I'm wrong in the comments below, but I can empirically state that the Flag would make a great mobile base because its 10 real-world equivalents already do. They're basically floating cities with crew accommodations, facilities for everything from working out to shopping to machining parts and equipment, main bridge for command and control, plus several other command and mission planning facilities, and a loadout of a mix of 85 to 90 planes and helicopters of various models. The Flag beats its real-world sister ships in a few ways, though. First and foremost is the speed at which it launches aircraft. The Flag seems to have 2 flight decks and 4 catapults like any other Nimitz carriers, but it's able to launch aircraft much faster. It's also got both cranes for launching hovercraft from the deck, sub-bays underneath to launch and recover subs, and angled launch racks for sharks with diver passengers. In the comics, it even had clamshell doors at the bow for launching landing craft. Just a great, realistic ship outfitted with some functionality to specifically support the Joes and their specialized equipment. I'm leaving it at 8 though because it ended up getting sunk by a couple of small holes in its hull. Number 7 is kind of a dark horse here, and maybe a bit unexpected. It's the Command Center from Challenge of the GoBots. I know, I'm second-guessing its placement here, or on the list at all, even as I narrate it. It barely meets my criteria other than by exceptions being made regarding crew and vehicles. I mean, they're technically the same thing, after all. It does at least carry the power suits, which constitute gear and equipment. It's also got all the facilities the GoBots need for maintenance, science, manufacturing, and whatever. It can travel through space, atmosphere, underwater, and across land, so it's pretty versatile. The issues that gave me doubts were purely in its design. In its flight mode, it looked kind of like a sleek train car, which is pretty cool, I guess. But in its walker form, it looks like an arthritic AT-AT. Watching it walk on the cartoon always just looked awkward. I guess it gets this high on the list because of the nostalgia factor. I had the toys of both this and Thruster, the Renegade counterpart, as a kid, and plenty of fun times playing with both. So putting it here is a bit of a moment of indulgence for little me, but hopefully you won't think it's wholly undeserved. So everything I said about the capabilities of aircraft carriers in the Flag entry applies for this one as well, except this one flies. No, it's not a shield helicarrier. Instead, my number 6 is the Justice carrier from Ring Raiders. Essentially, this is a flying variation on a standard aircraft carrier. However, this one had several things going for it that an ocean-faring carrier doesn't, beyond its capability to fly. First is the fact that it has several more launch bays than the Flag's 4 catapults. In fact, it looks like each aircraft in the Ring Raiders had its own bay, with a total of 16, all of which could launch nearly simultaneously. It also had the same ability as the smaller aircraft to be powered up by one of the Raiders' rings, giving it more power and speed and allowing it to be flown, telepathically, I guess? But all of that pales in comparison to the real thing that sets it apart from any other base on this list, which is its ability to time travel. That would normally get it higher on the list, but it wasn't really used much. Not surprising, given that the show only got 5 episodes, but still, they only really used it to recruit new pilots and chase the Skull Squadron through time to prevent their nefarious schemes. So it gets the 6th place spot based on its cool design, looking like an oversized love child of a B-2 and the Spruce Goose. Number 5 on this list goes to Vector Command from Sky Commanders. This thing met all of my requirements for a mobile base by being able to transport all the Sky Commander's other vehicles, having lab and engineering spaces, and serving as a living quarters for the team, while at the same time being something of a flying building. It was the weirdest concept in that it took off and landed vertically so that when stationary it was sort of a tower that they'd just kind of grav-lock to any convenient mountaintop, but it flew horizontally in a basic rectangular shape with some inverted delta-looking wings. That means that everything inside must have been equipped with some kind of gyro stabilization that kept it upright in either configuration. Otherwise, I can't even begin to imagine the mess they'd have to clean up every time they move. Granted, that doesn't look like the case here, but I'll give them the benefit of the doubt, by assuming they didn't have to put everything in the kitchen back in the cupboards every time they wanted to change location. And that's why it stays at number 5. My pick for number 4 is another one from a mostly lost show. Man, we've really got to do something about that before the others start to disappear too. But I digress. 4 is the Sark from Tiger Sharks. So you may have noticed as I've gone through the list so far that I'm using functionality as the basis for my ranking, but I'm also very heavily leveraging the rule of cool. After all, that was the most important part of all these things on the shows that featured them, and although I may reference real life, I'm sure as hell not letting it get in the way of enjoying what I want to enjoy, helicopters notwithstanding. And with that in mind, the Sark sits comfortably just outside of the top 3. It was a faster-than-light capable space-worthy flying submarine. The design was very much based on a shark, and it had a dorsal fin solar cell. It meets my definition of a mobile base by housing the crew, having plenty of command and science capabilities, and storing several mini-sub type vehicles. Best of all, though, it had the fish tank, the awesome technology that allowed the tiger sharks to go from human to fish people, or fish dogs in Gup's case. And that alone would have put it high on this list, but really, I put it up here because I'm a sucker for that black and gray camo pattern. Just looks plain awesome. And with that, we've reached the podium. First up at the number 3 spot is the SDF-1 from Robotech. I'm sure some of you who've watched some of my previous videos expected this to be number 1, as I think my love of Robotech is becoming more obvious each week. But there are a couple of mobile bases that I like even more than this one. However, I couldn't leave it out of the top 3 because it really does just have too much going for it. Not only is it bigger than anything else on this list, I mean its arms are easily essentially Argo sized, if not larger, but it literally has an entire city inside of it. That makes it the clear winner in terms of facilities for the crew. I mean, we often saw them eating at Min-May's family's restaurant in the city, inside the ship, but it actually loses at some points because it's filled with non-combatants and need to be protected each time the Zentradi catch up. But losing those few points doesn't mean much when you think about how it can transform into an enormous robot, has a main gun that can take out entire fleets, can instantaneously travel between points in space, and is filled to the brim with Veritech fighters, which we will definitely be taking a look at least one future list. Spoiler alert, I freaking love the Veritechs. But the SDF-1 only makes it to number 3 because it really does have a few shortcomings. Primarily amongst those is the fact that they can't convert to robot mode or use the main gun unless all of those previously mentioned civilians are secure, and their only defensive system is basically a version of Missile Command from the arcade. Other than that, I can't speak highly enough of the SDF-1. So, speaking of transforming, number 2 goes to... you know what? Guess. Yeah, number 2 is a transformer, so put which one you think it is down in the comments. I'll give you a few seconds. Done? Good. Number 2 is not Omega Supreme, it's not Metroplex, and it's not Scorponok. Number 2 on this list goes to the biggest transformer of them all, not counting Cybertron or Unicron, I guess, Fortress Maximus. This guy slash base slash battle station slash starship is just ridiculous. For reference, a chart I found puts him at close to twice as tall as Gypsy Danger from Pacific Rim, which means easily taller than any building in Hong Kong based on this scene from that movie. And, speaking of Gypsy Danger, he's the only mobile base on this list that carries a freaking sword, or at least he did in toy and comic form. So the sword is cool, the fact that he's the strongest and most powerful of the Transformers is cool, and the fact that he's essentially a quadruple changer is cool. The problem, and the reason he gets second place, is that those things don't all necessarily show themselves in the cartoon. In the show, he's basically a robot built by Spike instead of a regular Autobot. As a headmaster, he's basically a giant mech suit for Spike to pilot around. That's overall fine, seeing as all of the other entries on this list aren't exactly sentient either, but taken in the context of the Transformers mythology, it's kind of a lame origin. In the comics, he was an actual Autobot, and led them for a while after replacing Rodimus Prime. So he loses points for that. Awesome mobile base, not so awesome representation of a Transformer in the cartoon. So before we unveil our number 1, I have just a couple of honorable mentions. First is Ramrod from Saber Rider and the Star Sheriffs, and the other is the Battle Base from Jace and the Wheeled Warriors. Ramrod's essentially a micro version of the SDF-1 or Fortress Maximus, being a ship that can change into a large robot, but he's a lot smaller and never really shown to have the facilities to make him much of a base as the other bases I've covered. And the Battle Base, well, I guess you'd probably consider the Pride of the Skies to be the Lightning League's true headquarters, but it was still able to house all the other vehicles and provide some facilities for the characters. Plus, I wanted to put it on the list because it was another one I remember fondly from having the toy. There it is in the background, unsurprisingly pushed aside in favor of the Tomahawk. But that's enough about those. Let's close this list out. Our gold medal for the week, and my personal favorite of all the mobile bases in 80s animated action, and potentially all the ships and planes in 80s animated action, is the Phoenix from Battle of the Planets. Of all the vehicles that came out in the 80s, even though this one, I guess, technically came out in the 70s, this is the design that always stuck with me. It's got all the command systems G-Force needs, houses all 4 of the smaller vehicles, and like the Sark, can travel underwater and through space. It's got a super sleek design, plenty of weapons and maneuverability, and it's crewed by science ninjas. But most important of all, it can take on the Fiery Phoenix mode, or God Phoenix if you're anime inclined, and that pretty much made it invulnerable and able to just punch a hole through any other ship out there. It may be one of the smallest mobile bases on this list, and some of you may argue it isn't a base at all, but regardless, I consider it both the coolest looking and most powerful base out there. And yeah, it beats Fortress Maximus. Why? Because any single member of G-Force could take out Spike on their own, and without Spike, there's not really any Fortress Maximus to worry about. So not only is it the best mobile base, but its crew could probably take out all the other crews on this list as well. So it gets the gold medal, at least in my mind. And this also isn't from the 80s, but if you're a fan of Battle of the Planets, G-Force, or Eagle Riders, and you haven't seen any of the modern incarnations of Gatchaman, do yourself a favor and check one or more of them out. You can find affiliate links to pick up a copy below. Now, as you may all have noticed watching this video, I picked a lot of anime-adjacent shows to pull my winners from. Full transparency, when it comes to my love of media, 80s and yes, also 90s animated action are at the top, but anime is a close second. I plan to expand into some 90s shows in the future, as there are plenty I'd love to talk about with these shows I'm already covering, but if you'd be interested in hearing more about anime too, I'd be more than happy to chat about that as well. Let me know in the comments if that has any appeal. It definitely wouldn't become the main focus of this channel, but a few one-offs here and there, might be fun. But that's it for this list. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Did I miss any? Did I get the order wrong? Is my reasoning flawed? Or even my fundamental definition of what makes a base? I'd love to hear your thoughts. And on that note, thanks for watching. More top 10-ishes and other stuff like analyses and reviews coming soon. Do all the YouTube that YouTube wants you to YouTube. Check my links for cool 80s swag and where to buy some of these shows. Stay tuned and stay tuned. Like cartoons. Later.